Steve Jobs' journey into Zen. How an iconic tech genius used Eastern wisdom to change the world. Hey everyone. Welcome to Zen Go. I'll be sharing content about meditation and Eastern wisdom. Make sure to subscribe. Let's dive right in. Steve Jobs. One of the most legendary figures of the 20th century. But today, I want to talk about a side of him you might not know. His connection to Zen Buddhism. You know, when most people think of tech innovators, they picture someone hunched over a computer, obsessing over code and algorithms. But Jobs was fundamentally different. While his competitors were focused on features and specifications, Jobs was asking deeper questions about human nature and consciousness. This wasn't typical Silicon Valley, thinking this was ancient wisdom applied to modern technology. The Zen path of Steve Jobs. Sure, you know him as the co-founder of Apple, the genius behind the iPhone and iPad. But what you probably don't know is that his transformation into the Steve Jobs we admire today came from a deeply spiritual experience. His journey to India to practice meditation. That trip didn't just change his life, it shaped the soul of Apple as we know it. So, today's episode is all about how a barefoot hippie's spiritual trip to the East went on to reshape the entire global tech industry. What's remarkable is that in an industry driven by pure logic and engineering, Jobs brought something completely different to the table: intuition, mindfulness, and a deep understanding of what makes people feel connected to technology. While other companies were competing on hardware specs, Jobs was thinking about the emotional relationship between humans and machines. Chapter 1. A Rebel's Awakening. The Journey to India. It was the summer of 1974. Jobs was just 19 years old, long-haired, barefoot, and full of questions about life like, what's the point of all this? And back then, Apple didn't exist yet. He was just another lost young man, searching for something's meaning, like you and me. Picture this. America in 1974 was in the middle of a cultural revolution. The Vietnam War had just ended, the counterculture movement was in full swing, and young people everywhere were questioning everything their parents had built. Jobs wasn't just another hippie experimenting with Eastern philosophy. He was serious about finding answers to life's deepest questions. Then, he made a wild decision. He sold the only thing he owned, a beat-up Ford Mustang, and bought a one-way ticket to India. That took guts. Armed with just a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi and a few changes of clothes, he set off. He lived like a monk for 7 months, and what happened in that time? Well, he got super sick right after arriving, drank bad water, and caught dysentery. He dropped from 160 pounds to 120, skin and bones. Sometimes great insights come through great challenges. He even shaved his head and lived like a real ascetic. That image? You've probably seen it. It's iconic. But here's what most people don't realize. This experience of extreme vulnerability and suffering wasn't just an unfortunate side effect. It was actually central to his spiritual education. In Eastern philosophy, there's this idea that you have to be broken down before you can be built back up. When all your Western conditioning gets stripped away, when you're reduced to your most basic human needs, that's when real insight can happen. During that time, he met a local spiritual teacher in India who told him something that stuck with him forever. Westerners think with their heads, always about logic and ideas, that sort of thing. But we feel with our hearts. We feel connection with each other, with everything. That line flipped a switch in Jobs. He started thinking, shouldn't tech products also be designed to feel more human? Should we stop focusing just on specs and instead pay attention to how people experience technology? Yeah, why should we have to adapt to cold machines when machines could adapt to us? We don't need to master complex interfaces just to use our phone. This insight was revolutionary because it challenged the entire foundation of how technology was being developed in the 1970s. Most engineers thought their job was to pack as many features as possible into a device. Jobs realized that the real challenge was figuring out which features not to include. It was about editing, not adding. That's the seed of what we now call user experience. And it started right there, starting from Jobs. That's why Apple products feel so intuitive. And today, I think a lot of Asian tech companies do this really well too. If you've ever used an app like RedNote, which comes from a Chinese tech company, you know there's something subtly different about the design. Back to that book he carried around, Autobiography of a Yogi. One line became his lifelong mantra. True wisdom is not in books full of cold facts. It's found in silence. And in that silence, he realized, tech should serve humanity, not the other way around. That's why decades later, the wisdom from that little book would help create the iPhone you use to snap photos, the iPad you use to draw, and the MacBook you use to work. Jobs once said, India taught me that intuition is way more powerful than intellect. Because intuition comes from our subconscious, our deeper self, not just the surface level thinking we do every day. Intuition is the bridge between us and the universe. Chapter 2. How Zen Buddhism shaped Apple's design philosophy. After returning to the US, Jobs met another life-changing teacher, Kobun Chino Otogawa, a Japanese Zen monk. He practiced a form of Zen Buddhism that originally came from China Tang dynasty, which is called Soto Zen. The core idea? Kong, null. Emptiness. If you've experienced the recent hit 3D game Black Myth, Wukong, you'd understand that the Kong, void emptiness, in Wukong, embodies the fundamental principle of his Buddhist tradition, kind of like letting go of mental noise, so we can see things clearly. Now, Kobun wasn't your typical spiritual teacher. He was known for his sharp intelligence and unconventional teaching methods. He would often give Jobs seemingly impossible riddles or challenge him with paradoxical questions. The relationship between them lasted for years, with Jobs regularly attending meditation sessions and retreats. Think of it like this. When muddy water sits still, the sediment settles and the water becomes clear. That's what Zen does for the mind. When your mind is like water with no dirt settled, no distracting thoughts, then you will have wisdom. Kobun gave Jobs his first Zen riddle. All things return to one. Where does the one return to? Sounds mysterious, right? It just means realizing what doesn't matter, so you can focus on what does. Actually, in our life, 99% of things doesn't matter, and when you finally find that 1% is important, that is true. That is your only way. That is why Jobs said, follow your heart, don't trust your eyes. That idea exactly influenced Apple's design philosophy. This principle became Jobs' secret weapon in business. While other tech companies held endless meetings debating minor features, Jobs could cut through the noise instantly. He'd look at a prototype and immediately know what needed to be removed. His colleagues often said it was like he had a sixth sense for what mattered and what didn't. First, simplicity is everything. Remember when Nokia phones were full of buttons, like little computers? If you're Gen Z, you might have never used one like that. You would be familiar with it if you watched Steve Jobs' iPhone keynote in 2007. Now think back to the original iPhone. It had just one button. Maybe it seems like nothing to you now, but back in 2007, that was revolutionary. The entire tech industry thought he was insane. How could you control a complex device with just one button? Where was the keyboard? How would people navigate menus? But Jobs understood something profound. The best interface is no interface. The closer you can get to direct manipulation, touching, swiping, pinching, the more natural technology feels. Jobs used to say, innovation isn't about adding more. It's about removing the unnecessary. Same goes for the iPod. Remember Sony's Walkman? Lots of buttons. If you give it to someone, they may be confused. And the iPod? Just one scroll wheel. Smaller, simple, and beautiful. When the design team once showed Jobs 30 prototype ideas for the iPod, he said, "None of these are simple enough." Then he dropped the prototype into a fish tank and pointed at the bubbles. See those air pockets? That means there's space. Make it smaller. This story perfectly captures the Zen principle of emptiness in action. In Zen philosophy, empty space isn't absence, it's potential. The empty space in a room is what makes it useful. The silence between notes is what makes music beautiful. Jobs understood that the spaces between features, the things you don't include, are just as important as what you do include. Now think about MacBooks. Over time, Apple kept removing ports. Early MacBooks had many ports. By recent years, they simplified to mainly USB-C ports. And today's MacBooks? They focus on essential connectivity. Soon the headphone jack might disappear too. And honestly, who's still using wired headphones with a laptop? All of that stems from one idea. Less is more. Yes, this comes from Western modern design aesthetics, Bauhaus. But it's also deeply inspired by Eastern philosophy, what Jobs learned from Zen and his time in India. This philosophy has now spread far beyond Apple. Look at modern web design. Clean, minimal, lots of white space. Look at Tesla's interiors. One screen, minimal buttons. Look at architecture. The most admired buildings today are often the most minimal ones. Jobs' Zen-inspired approach to design has literally reshaped how we think about everything from technology to lifestyle. But here's what's really amazing. This ancient wisdom isn't just changing how we design products, it's changing how we live our lives. The mindfulness movement, the popularity of meditation apps, the trend toward minimalism, all of these can be traced back to the same insights Jobs discovered in that Indian ashram decades ago. Oh, and by the way, iPhone 17 is coming soon, and it finally supports 120 Hz refresh rate. Bravo! God bless Cook. Finally, we can play major mobile games on iPhones. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll continue talking about Steve Jobs in the next episode. See you next time.